So we were having a really interesting conversation last week about a specific element of longevity. And people always talk about physical health, mental health, social health, spiritual health. But one really interesting element to mental health, which I think is super important, I've heard Peter Attia talk about it a lot. He talks about it in his recent book, Outlive, is emotional health. And when we started talking about that, it was interesting to think through like what in a simple gauge for emotional health is. And one of those things is just your ability to cry. And, I find that it's either really hit or miss, especially with guys. Some guys find it really easy to cry. They're in touch with their emotions. Other guys have a really difficult time. And obviously you and I have gone back and forth on this as sort of different sides of the coin. But I'm really interested to hear your take and kind of understanding for why are there people that can cry sometimes and some people that can't. Like, what's your understanding of that, and how does your background give you more context on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, hey, everybody, my name's Matt. This is Andrew. And as he said, we have different backgrounds. I had a lot of my life where I just couldn't cry, basically. I was like a machine. And Andrew, he's the opposite. He can't stop crying. It's kind of weird. We might not make it through this podcast, actually. No, I'm just kidding. He is much more well-adjusted and healthy. So yeah, the topic of why can't I cry? Super interesting topic in general. Like you said, leaning towards males more. Yes, I guess I or we can talk about that with a tiny bit more of authority than everybody, but I think it applies to everybody. It's like the meme you've seen online, emotional damage, right? So that will be one of the reasons that we get into. Personally, my experience, and we can dig into some details if it becomes relevant. But between outside forces and inside forces, I had a bit of a tough childhood, and my emotions became scary, tough, and unsafe. So to compensate with that, I became a very logical, rational person. That was the weapon that I could wield, that was safe, that I felt comfortable wielding. And I kind of acted out as a kid. I had a bad temper as a kid, which we'll get into. Later, I isolated a lot. I became very depressed, had a lot of anxiety. And it was all related to me not being able to feel or appropriately express my emotions, which I didn't realize until much later. And what that basically culminated into was a small life, a sad life, a scared life, a miserable life that I really honestly didn't want to be a part of anymore. And through a lot of hard work and experience, I've dug out of that. And if we're able to shed any light on why people or men can't cry and maybe some of the reasons behind that, depending on how deep in the weeds we want to get, and maybe what some solutions or some first steps are on that.
Was there a moment in time that you realized that there were other people that had a bigger or different connection with their emotions that were able to cry, and you kind of self-reflected on that?
I guess the first thing that comes to mind when you say that, and I'm not proud of this, but is I did feel different. I did feel special growing up through my teens and probably my 20s, but that's because I thought I was superior. So I did see most everyone else having more of a connection to their emotions, and I viewed that as weak or inferior. Logic, rational, reason, surgical. Again, that's what I could rely on and use. I viewed emotions as weak, and I did see a difference between myself and others. And so, yeah, I don't know. That was most of my early life and 20s. And again, I guess I thought that was a superpower. I thought I was special because of that. And in the end, which we'll probably get into, it's actually a gigantic weakness and keeps your life really sad and miserable and small.
So what was the turning point for you where you maybe looked in the mirror someday and thought to yourself, I have to get to better understand myself? Or was it an event that set you off? What was the turning point because now I feel like you're a lot more in touch with your emotions. And so what was that turning point?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll give two really quick examples, and if either interesting, we could double click on them or move on to some of the reasons maybe why people can't feel their emotions. But the two things that came to mind when you said that, was there like a moment? There's obviously a ton of moments, but I would say in my late 20s, early 30s, that I had been on such a just terrible trajectory in my professional life, in my personal relationships, and with my significant other, my self-esteem. It was all so poor, so negative. I was so depressed, had so much anxiety. I didn't want to live. But I don't know. Like, you hear about rock bottoms, and some people's rock bottoms, unfortunately, are really low because their emotions are so damaged that you have to get to such a pain point that you actually get to those emotions that are so down deep and broken. And I guess I kind of got to that point. My job, I was in management, and it was, a pretty rough job. I'll leave it at that. And I just wouldn't leave. I thought I deserved the treatment that I had there. Again, my long-term relationship was going very poorly. I wasn't achieving. I guess it was just a buildup of residue over time of just depression, self-hate, anxiety, and like the despair grew and grew and grew on the scale until like finally, I guess, whatever my pain point number was, it must have just hit. And I did have some serious help in my life that, I'd like to think I could have pulled out of this by myself. I don't know if that's true. But probably several rock bottoms. The other thing I would say, one specific time that I noticed that, like, I knew I was depressed and needed to work on myself. And I was already years in my self-help journey and fixing my life. But this may sound funny, but this was just my story. I didn't have access to my emotions. At least I didn't appropriately have access to my emotions. And like my better half, who I proudly have been with for 23 years now, we went from hell to heaven. The story's insane. But before I'd fix my emotions, we would have like serious, like beautiful and sad moments, and emotion wouldn't come out of me, just went dead. And I knew it wasn't right. And she would cry, or, other appropriate things would happen, and I wouldn't cry in the appropriate manner. But later, I would go on YouTube and I would watch music reaction videos. Okay. And it would be to one of my favorite bands. And I'd be sitting there and I'd watch it because I like the music. And in our digital age, it is what it is. That's a little bit of a sense of a community, even though it's not, it feels like it. So I'd watch these people watch the music that was really important to me. And when they would really like a song or really like a moment in a song, I can see goosebumps on my arm right now. I still feel it, even though I've healed. My eyes would get wet. And I was like, what what? I'm malfunctioning. I'm the Tin Man. What is it? Who put these tears in my eyes? And I knew at that moment something was broken, something was wrong. Like I kind of knew, but that's one of those moments that hit me. I was like, okay, I have emotion. It doesn't come out when it's supposed to. And also another weird one is like when a team would win a championship. Like even if I didn't know or care about either Super Bowl team, I'd see all these men cheering and holding each other up and screaming, and my chest got so tight, and I would get wet eyes, and I'd be like, what is happening to me? But my wife would be sad and crying, and I'd be like, does not compute. So yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so that is a really big thing to step into. Again, I could say one or two reasons, and we could double click if one sounds more interesting than the other. The one that people are probably most familiar with and sounds like a stereotype, but unfortunately, there's a lot of truth in stereotypes, is like socialization. So we all get socialized, right? And maybe things have changed a tiny bit in the last 5 or 10 years that social media has gotten so big. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so not for me at all. Your handsome self is a decade younger than me, but you had the internet, but you didn't have social media when you were a little kid. So you probably had a more similar childhood than I did. And I think things are getting better and softer now. Like, I don't know. That's a different conversation. But boys and girls get socialized. And, it's nature and nurture, but I'm super aware of this. This is my interest. I use it to heal myself and others. But like when I have my little niece and nephew in front of me, I have to constantly catch myself because I'll even use a slightly higher octave when I talk to my niece. You know what I mean? I give her all the best hugs, and then my nephew, we're wrestling. I'm gonna get you. And that's not bad inherently, but you have to watch that. We do treat boys and girls differently. We absolutely do. And is it because they're showing different signals? Of course, that's got to be part of it. But certainly, we are programming a ton of those signals in there. And everywhere you hear nature versus nurture. And the smart way to just say it is 50-50, right? It's not, but they both have a lot of weight. So let's say 50-50 to save the conversation. I personally believe, and with my academia and my actual real life, trials and everything I've gone through, I do believe the scale is tilted more towards socialization to nurture. Nature is huge. It's absolutely huge. It should never be denied. But our socialization is huge, and men are taught to repress weak feelings. We are. It's not rewarded, and we're being trained when we're little beautiful animals, and the emotions that are allowed, that are sanctioned, tend to be strong emotions, which is going to be aggression and anger. And the stereotype is that we're in sports, right? And that's the time when you're able to bust somebody's skull in and yell and get that aggression out. So what you feed is going to grow, and what you repress, is going to go away. Spoiler alert, it's not. But in the day-to-day, it does. So socialization is huge with that. And in the end, all we're doing is we are repressing parts of ourselves, because all of us have the full rainbow of emotions, and we need to learn how to respect them and process them and handle them in a good way. And when any people, but especially men or boys in this case, are taught from the womb on that certain emotions are acceptable or not acceptable, we start being taught from day one to repress parts of ourselves, to be inauthentic. And when you're inauthentic, it doesn't turn out well for you. So definitely one of the main reasons is socialization.
I'm really interested in hearing your take on some of the more in the weeds neurochemistry and what's going on with the subconscious mind. But before we get there, just to really tie it back, what would you say to your younger self if you were, if you talked to Matt when you were sort of in the height of repressing your emotions and having a difficult time, judging other people, really like more in touch with your anger than anything else? Like, what would you recommend to yourself, and how could you even convey that to yourself in a thoughtful way without, because your younger self might even judge your older self. So how would you go about that conversation?
I would say buy Bitcoin now. No, and I don't even need to push back. I guess one pushback I would say is what age, but I don't even think I need that. I've gone through this exercise before, and it's fun. And I'll give you an answer. My first initial answer is nothing. I wouldn't listen to myself.
Right.
It's
so you just wouldn't be receptive at all.
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. The wiring was broken. It was so far underground. I'd have no effing idea what you were talking about. I think you were full of shit. I was, depending on what age, I was so arrogant and a false sense of superiority because my logic and rational would tear you apart. So yeah, I don't think I could say anything to myself. Like one example that I'd love to give on this, and I don't know if it fits perfectly, we're underwater, right? And we're in a fish community, and there's two young fish, and they're walking by an old man fish. And then they're just talking about the day, and they're going to go play water polo or whatever the hell. And they walk past the old man fish, and he says to the kids, "Oh, how's the water today, boys?" And they look at him, and they're like, "What the hell's this idiot talking about? What's water? Anyway, he's crazy." And they just walk by. I would, those fish have never been out of the water. They have no idea they're in water. They were born in the water. They've breathed the water. They've seen the water. They have no idea what you're talking about. When you're immersed in it from birth, those little fish would have to be pulled out of the water, thrown in a boat, have a hook pulled out of their mouth, see a hunter with a cap on going, "Oh yeah, I got me a prize." And then he drops them in the water. And then they're like, "Holy shit. Let me tell you about the water." So I don't think that young fish version of myself would have listened to me. Now let's take that caveat away, because I understand what you're saying. Man, I think I would try, and I guess this is just to me, appeal to my arrogance or my want for superiority or power, because I overcompensated because I didn't have control over my emotions, which is your true power. I would try to trick that young man by saying, "Yo," I'd open my coat and I'd say, "You want some real power, kid?" And I would just say, like, your logic and your ration and your reason, that's really good. It's so powerful. It's so tough, but it's only one tool in your tool belt. And I know this sounds crazy, but I'm you from the future. So just give me 5 seconds to tell you this. Even if you need to express it alone, if you need to journal about it, if you need to go in a room and like yell and scream or something like that, you really need to try to feel your emotions. You need to make time for it. And you can keep it private. You don't have to tell anybody else. It's no problem. But all of your real power in life is in your emotions. And again, you can fake it. You can act logical and reasonable in public. No problem. Keep doing that. But dude, I'm telling you, all the money, all the juice of life, all the excitement is in the emotion. So you ignore them at your peril. And I would try to appeal to his sense of arrogance and lust for power.
That's good. And I've heard you say before that we're emotional creatures first, logical and creatures second. So help me understand, if that's the case, first of all, why is that? And second of all, why in your case was your logic overriding your like survival mechanism?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, I mean, anybody that's watching this and wants to know why can't they cry or what's wrong with their emotions, they're gonna feel the same thing, that they're a logical, rational creature, and I can promise you, you're not. And if you're a man of complete science and rational, like I was, then I can appeal to that. So, again, very quickly, and we can double tap on anything that's interesting. The way we evolved is our brain started off at the brain stem in the lizard brain, your limbic system, and that's the first thing that evolved. And as time went on, we grew the midbrain, which is the mammalian brain, right? And then last but not least, we grew this big, beautiful fat neocortex, right? Our prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is where your logic and reason lives. And it's beautiful. It's amazing. It's given us all that we have. And it all works as a team. But when you're out in the world, okay, and you have anything come through your senses, you see, smell, hear, a dog runs at you, somebody's tailing you in a car, somebody gives you a dirty look, those senses go into your body and it goes up in reverse order the way we evolved. So that signal is going to go through your limbic emotional system first. Then it's going to pass through your mammalian brain, where a lot of emotions are processed as well. And last, dead last, but not least, that old worn out information eventually is going to get tossed up to your prefrontal cortex. It's old news. It's like legacy media. It's outdated by the time it gets to your prefrontal cortex. So it goes through the emotions, And you have an emotional reaction, which if you start paying attention, you're honest, you can usually feel in your body first. That's something I wasn't in touch with. But by the time it gets to your prefrontal cortex, again, you've already gone through all that hardware. So that is why I say we're an emotional creature first, because I'm like not even trying to make a judgment here. It's just the order of operations. It's just kind of passionless and boring, you know.
Like literally the information goes through the emotional brain before it gets to the logical brain, even if that takes place in a nanosecond. But that makes sense. If the dog runs at you, even if it's your own dog, for example, and you just turn around and it catches you off guard for a split second, you're probably going to jump and react.
Yeah, for sure. So no, it's literally just the order that the hardware evolved. The message goes in the same order. And yeah, it may be a millisecond, but in terms of the speed of the electricity that goes through, it might as well be a week. And we may or may not get into that. Like your prefrontal cortex is full of shit, and it's always lying to you. But what else did we say? We said, why are we emotional creature? And then why was I such a logical person? So that was the second part. And this might be really important for anybody that has problems with their emotions. Why can't I cry? So it relates to the first reason, socialize to repress emotions, right? So if we're repressing emotions, then we are going to give more value to our logic and our reason. Another reason for that, so that's an external reason, socialization from media, our parents, everybody, right? But the internal reason for that is why you'd be more logical than emotional is if your emotions feel unsafe to you. And how would that happen? Well, I like to call them trapped emotions. It's a little less, bothersome for people, especially for men that might be watching this that have emotional problems or why can't they cry. They're not gonna like the T word. Here's a trigger warning for all my men out there. A lot of us have trauma. Okay, so again, I like to say trapped emotion. It sounds a little softer, but when we go through things, especially in our childhood, they are emotions that overwhelm our baby brains at the moment that it happens, and it's too much for us to process. And babies don't have logic and reason. A lot of studies show that the prefrontal cortex doesn't turn on until you're at least 7. Okay, so before that, you really are totally an emotional little monster, right?
Yeah.
So from age 0 to for sure 6, your emotions are taking what's happening around you. And if you got a great parent like Andrew who's loving you and taking care of you, you're mostly going to be okay. But if you grew in an environment that maybe I grew up in, these emotions are going to flood you. They're going to feel unsafe. And this may sound like an exaggeration, but to the baby brain that can't logic it out, these feel existential, like life or death situations. And to a little baby brain like that, these life and death existential emotions, they can be too much. Now, it's very tricky, right? You could have 10 different kids in the same situation, and we're all wired differently. We all have different genes, so that's where nature comes in. And the parent could run in and scream and throw something at the wall. And, this is just an example, but maybe 8 out of 10 of those kids just could handle that or process it a different way, and they don't get traumatized by it. But a certain amount of those kids, maybe 1 or 2 of them, take it as this big existential deadly threat emotionally. They can't logic it out, and that emotion is too overwhelming for them, and that emotion gets trapped. It actually gets trapped in your midbrain, specifically your hypothalamus, but it gets trapped there. It actually gets trapped there. You can see trauma on brain scans. It's absolutely amazing. It doesn't get processed into your long-term memory, which is where it is supposed to go. So quite literally, we have to rely on our logic and reason because these emotions are too scary, too powerful. We couldn't process them. And then when one emotion is too much and you have to hold them down, it can end up affecting all of your emotions, which then affects your entire life.
Wow. So for you in particular, I asked you previously, what was the moment where you were able to just get in better touch with your emotions? But, with the trauma that you referenced, when was it that you started to unravel that or start to work on that? And how does somebody even go about that? That's, dealing with it probably unaware that that's why they are leaning more on their logical, rational mind. So, two-part question. How would you go about starting to unravel the trauma, and what did that look like in your particular story?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question. Again, I'll try to give bullet points, and if anything's interesting, it could be double clicked on. But how does someone start unraveling it? There's steps to this, obviously. And what I like to say is step 0 is awareness. So that's why we try to have conversations and talk about this stuff, because at the very least, you can't do anything if you're not aware. And I don't know if that sounds like a slogan or whatever, but it's absolutely true. For so long, I wasn't aware. I just kept living a life of depression, anxiety, accepting lower standards in my life, accepting bad relationships, accepting horrible, terrible self-talk. Because I was that young fish in water, I didn't know I was in water. So how do you begin unraveling that? Awareness is key. Some people are going to have to hit one or several rock bottoms, is the unfortunate truth. But the cool thing of when you hit a rock bottom, that is the opportunity maybe to be open to hearing some of these things we're talking about. The next step is going to be being curious and questioning. So I had to do a lot of that. That was years, and I did it all from scratch. And to be fair, I consumed a lot of self-help, content from a lot of the big names you've heard, and a lot of that was really valuable. It really was, to give phrases and definitions and ideas to put behind these broken feelings I had, right? I didn't have the labels. I didn't understand what was going on. So that was useful, being curious and questioning things. But yeah, really, eventually, I would say that I obviously knew something was wrong after one of my last big rock bottoms. And if we just want something concrete, which I think is useful, there's a lot of reasons to do this, but meditation, like, absolutely was a huge pivot point in me pointing my body in the right direction to start healing. So if we're talking about like starting points, this is a very long path that anybody can go through and rewire their brain, but just being able to sit in silence and see all the crazy shit that was coming out of my subconscious, that I was that young fish in water, and meditation was forcing me to be the old man fish, and seeing that I was in water, seeing this stew of negativity and self-hate and depression and anxiety. Oh my God, what? This was all there? Again, it's great. I'm getting goosebumps while saying this. The whole point is we've repressed it, we've hid it, we've pushed it down from socialization, from trauma on the inside. Do it at the pace that works for you. It's hard, but you got to start being aware, and you got to start really being curious and interested. Definitely meditation, being silent, watching the crazy crap that was coming out of my brain was definitely one of the biggest steps for me, at least.
So the awareness piece, and I've noticed this in my own life, developing awareness just about my own thought patterns, that my subconscious, things that I may have going on in the background. Meditation has been by far and away the greatest habit for uncovering and better understanding myself. So it sounds like that's step one to developing awareness, at least maybe even just acknowledging that you should start some sort of mindfulness or meditation practice. And then step 2, moving into curiosity, that's where the actual meditation, the practice itself, allowing yourself to look at thoughts and emotions coming out of, the back of your mind really objectively. And like you said, acknowledging, oh my goodness, like this is some crazy levels of hatred or anger. Or so from there, what else did you use as far as tools? Is that when this, similar time period with the meditation that you started to get into journaling? Did you write down things that were coming up with meditation? How did you start to move through that curiosity phase? Because I'm sure that was super overwhelming.
Yeah, again, a great question. And I know it's why we want to help and do the things we do, because we both went through our separate trials and tribulations, and we've both been through our own, decade of hell, or whatever you want to call it. And it was a really slow, arduous process. And yeah, both of our goals, I don't mean to speak for you, but is to maybe cut that time down. And, it's not going to be perfect, but we both crawled out of our own little hells. So there was big time gaps between these things, but definitely hitting rock bottom was huge. And then meditating to actually start being aware, as we said, curiosity, but then I paired that with questioning. So just seeing the crazy shit come out of your head, that's good, that's important, but like, wait a minute, let's question that. One thing that I would point out is to, once you start making time to actually be quiet and listen to your mind, whether that's meditation or journaling, when those things come out and you question them, the more you do that, the more it's going to happen for you. That is how our brain is programmed. And I could go on a side tangent on that. I won't. But just for the sake of this conversation, trust but verify. But trust that that's true for me right now. The more that you focus on something, the more you're going to get. And I noticed that the more I meditated, started journaling, paying attention to the subconscious and all the crazy stuff that bubbled out, the more those moments would happen for me. And I started having what I call light switch moments. It's just what I call it. It's when like an idea or something happens in your life and the light turns on and you just never see the world the same again. And to make the story super bite-sized and short, because this is when I was managing in retail, I had insurance, and I just loathed myself, didn't care about myself, didn't take care of myself. My teeth were turning brown, dude. It was like horrible. And it was totally just because I didn't care about myself. And to make a long story short, after a long time, I went to the dentist and they were doing whatever they were doing. I hadn't been in my adult life, by the way. I was like 29 or 30. Okay. So I hadn't been in my adult life. That's how much I didn't give a crap about myself. And when they were done, they put the mirror in front of my face, standard, and all the brown was gone. And I got super lucky. It was just a ton of plaque, drinking too much coffee. I didn't have any damage. I got super lucky. And that sounds like routine or whatever, but it cracked something in my brain in a good way, because I started meditating, I started journaling, so my brain was primed to start questioning and looking for stuff. And when I saw that mirror and I saw the brown was off my teeth, I've always had this voice in my head that said, you're a piece of garbage. You don't deserve to be taken care of. Your teeth are rotten. And these are emotions. So if you're listening to this and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, you're right. It's illogical. It's irrational. It is emotional. You're absolutely right when you say that. But it was the first time that I can remember where those negative voices hit counter evidence. And we're like, no, you're wrong. No, you're actually wrong. And like, again, it was such a huge inflection point where I was like, oh, maybe I'm not a piece of shit. Maybe I don't deserve to be depressed and full of anxiety. Maybe I started questioning stuff. So the curiosity is huge, but then you move in the questioning phase, which is really important too. And then, yeah, I mean, the more you do it, the more you focus on it, the more you're going to move in that direction. The self-help, I got a little too far into. You can get addicted to that, folks. So that's a big warning. That's another conversation. But some of it is good, but you got to act on it. You got to act on it. You got to act on it. But some of the self-help moved me into more modalities. love them or hate them. Everybody has good and bad in them, but I use Jordan Peterson's journaling system. It's called self-authoring. It was like $20. It was absolutely worth it. I wish he had an affiliate link. I'd give it to you. I really believe in the product. I did it. It did a lot for me. But you write out your whole life. And one thing that did for me is I saw all my trauma and all the different phases of my life. And, if you just talk about one memory, you're like, yeah, everybody has that thing that happened. Yeah, everybody has that thing that happened. Oh, yeah, no, I guess that happened. But once the whole epoch of my entire life was up in front of me, and I saw this poor baby brain only had 6 months where it wasn't getting extreme trauma, it hit me like a truck. And I was like, holy shit, the amount of self-compassion that flowed into me. And I went, wow. I would always downplay what happened to me. I would always minimize it. Well, I wasn't in a war zone. Well, I wasn't. Nah, man. Once you really, truly start respecting what you went through, which that journaling program did for me, that was a big, huge change. And to sum it up quickly, again, can double click on anything. But I eventually got to the point where I was brave and curious enough to go into therapy, but specifically I went into trauma therapy. There's a big difference between talk therapy and trauma therapy, where I got to really, that's advanced, start to dig into those emotions that we know were broken. And last but not least, and this is not a recommendation from Andrew or myself, but psychedelic therapy is something that people can choose to look into or not look into. And I personally had an amazing experience that culminated after almost a decade of really hard work and identifying what was wrong and what my intentions were. And I'd already gone a lot of the way. That was like an amazing cherry on top for me. So there's a million little strings within there, but like high level bullet points. Those are some of the big things that move the needle a lot for me, allowing me to get in touch with my feelings, which changed my entire life, which put color and juice and excitement and motivation, changed my job, changed my relationship and everything. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. One thing I want to pull out there that I see all the time and I've experienced in my own life, I think everybody experiences it at different points in their life, is how powerful it is to give yourself evidence to the contrary of something that you believe. And what I mean by that is if you're stuck in a rut, even if you're not in a rut, but for whatever reason you grow up and you believe, I'm not good at playing the piano. And then one day or one week you decide, I'm going to try and teach myself this song, or I'm going to take a couple lessons and try and learn a song. And after a couple hours, you can play a couple chords. Just that little bit of evidence to the contrary of that limiting belief that I can't do this thing. Just having that tiny little pebble of evidence is enough for a lot of people to break that belief, or at least start to crack that belief and open up the possibility that, well, maybe I can learn this thing, or maybe I am different than I previously thought. So I love that story that you just told, because it's a perfect example of getting this piece of evidence that you look at and you're like, I have been telling myself for so long that I'm a piece of shit. And all of a sudden I have this obvious evidence that I'm not a piece of shit. And it just kind of like immediately cracks that belief. At the end of the day, the best remedy for limiting beliefs is action, because it gives you the evidence. But it's just so difficult to start taking that action for a lot of people, because when you're stuck in a rut, it's a lot easier said than done to just haul yourself up. But no, I love that story. I think it's a perfect example of that.
No, I think that's really great. If I can add just one caveat, because I just want to let everybody know I 100% agree with what Andrew said. The only caveat I want to dig out here on this topic is some people have to get to the point where they can register that evidence. And there are some steps beforehand if people have trauma or emotional issues that at a certain premature point, they won't be able to even process that evidence. That's where I had meditated and already gone through like a couple of years of my work where that evidence did hit. You're totally right. I don't disagree with that. But I encourage people to look up learned helplessness. It's just such an amazing topic, but you can be programmed. You can totally be programmed to not believe the evidence that's in front of your eyes. And your brain gets wired poorly when you're young. And as Andrew said, and I think I've mentioned here, you can rewire any of this stuff. That's the cool part. But there can be what I judge is an earlier part if you have a lot of trauma. There's some pre-work, there's some moves that have to be made, there's some discoveries that have to be made, where sometimes that evidence might not be as effective. But no, for sure, super powerful.
Anything that you would add? I mean, we've talked about like meditation for starting to build the awareness and the curiosity. You mentioned Jordan Peterson's journaling exercise. Anything else for you that's top of mind as far as resources go for people that would be helpful to start building that awareness around what's going on in their minds and start developing that curiosity so they can start to notice those opportunities and rewire?
Yeah. So, I mean, everybody's journey is going to be different. Everybody's in a different spot. I mean, one thing I would say, whether it sounds like a slogan or not, it's anybody that's watching that this drew their attention. Why can't I cry? Emotional problems, that their life is small and not what they want it to be. A quote that meant a lot to me is, I just eventually was sick of being sick. And this doesn't have to, just obviously talk about like a physical problem like Andrew talks about, like good diet and exercise and taking care of your physicality. Mental health is physical health, in my opinion. So are you sick of being sick? Are you sick of being sick? Are you that young fish in water that has just lived your whole life feeling broken, feeling down? This is neurochemistry. Okay, this is something that we can work on and adjust. I'm telling you, life is not supposed to be this way. You don't have to stay in that shitty job. You don't have to stay in that bad relationship. Now, I know, way easier said than done, but you have to at least hear it. You have to at least hear it. So, are you sick of being sick? Life does not have to be this way. And as I kind of said earlier, it's awareness. So we talked about meditation, possible journaling. Another thing that you can do to bring more awareness to yourself is something called like a vibe check. This may sound silly, but when we're rebuilding emotions from the bottom up, and again, this is a side tangent I could go into, so I encourage you to look it up yourself, but there's a condition called alexithymia, and this is emotional color blindness. So when we go through trauma, whether it's big, crazy trauma or little, small trauma, which we didn't get into, there's a small T and a big T trauma. A big T trauma is like war, natural disasters, sexual assault, horrible things like that. Little T trauma is just neglect, like small little fears, like daily. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts when you're a kid, and emotionally you can't handle it. These both wire in the brain as trauma. They freeze or suppress your emotions, and then you can't live a full, happy life. And people that have that have alexithymia, which again is called emotional color blindness. So you're not aware of your own emotions. You're also not fully aware of other people's emotions, which is crazy. So it's like if you got injured and you have to learn to walk again. You have to learn to vibe again, or to like check in with your emotions. So getting emotion wheels, you can just search them online. I mean, on Google Images, you get a ton. I have resources I could put in the description if we want to, but yeah, put a reminder in your phone a couple times a day that comes up and it's just like vibe check, and you have the wheel, you have different emotions on it, and you just repeatedly try to put a phrase to it, try to put a word to it. It's a start. And yeah, I mean, I kind of went over a couple more, but therapy can be tricky. Don't get me wrong. If you recoil when you hear therapy, I understand. It's super important that you're with the right person. That's everything. You could throw everything else in the garbage. Like, I get it. I understand hesitancy, especially with males. But you just want to make sure you have the right person. If I could just underline one thing, because it's really not about what the person says to you, it's who says it to you, and they have to have credibility. You have to have a good vibe with them. But no, I mean, geez, it's a big topic. We've said a lot. I think there's at least some breadcrumbs to get started and look there. And yeah, I don't know.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your experience and advice. And I feel like the topic of why some people cry, some people don't cry, or how people are in touch or out of touch with their emotions, and just the underlying mechanisms behind that and the importance of it, it's just a great topic for people to be aware of. What haven't we covered that you feel like is relevant on this topic during this conversation?
A million things, but I'm going to spare you, and I'm going to put some suspense for one of the next times we talk. I think we covered this topic pretty solidly, at least with breadcrumbs to be curious and to dig in more. The things that I would point people to, which will require a longer explanation, would be looking into alexithymia. You very likely have that. If you have any amount of trauma at all, if your life is depressed, has anxiety, you are not living the life you want, there's a very high chance that you are suffering from alexithymia. And just knowing what's wrong can be a huge step forward. So I would look into alexithymia. Also, as I said, when I wrote my journaling prompt and I saw how much I had been through, not only do I recommend doing that, but self-compassion is absolutely gigantic in this. It took me a decade of crawling out, and obviously I'd like to make that a shorter trip for many people, but it takes a while, and you're going to screw up, and it's going to be hard. And self-compassion is absolutely huge. So that's why I also recommend that people look up learned helplessness, because you get programmed from the womb to be ineffective, and then you forget it, and then you live your whole life that way, and you can't move. Only warning I'll give you is it was on some pretty gnarly animal experiments. So if that bothers you, maybe not go into those experiments, but you can learn the general understanding by looking into it. So learn about self-compassion with learned helplessness, alexithymia. And yeah, I think we covered a lot of good points today.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I appreciate you sharing all that stuff. This was great.
Yeah, it was good talking to you, and I'm glad you actually finally made it through a call without crying like 4 or 5 times. I'm proud of you, dude.
I started to tear up a couple times. You just didn't
I
see it.
thought, no, I could tell. All right, brother.